Hello, Hyperfixation Nation. This is Get Your Fix, a podcast where we chat all things fandom, good, bad, and ugly, with me, your host, Vaughn. Over here, we are not afraid to deep it and effuse earnestly about all the properties that resonate with us. If this is your first time listening, thank you for joining me. And if you've been on this journey with me for a while, then welcome back. You can read more about the Get Your Fix project and subscribe on all of your favorite platforms by visiting getyourfixpod.card.co. That's CARRD. As always, I am available also on Instagram. So check it out, subscribe, do all that good stuff. And thank you all so much for the love on last episode, talking about Mystic Messenger. I really feel like my Otome girlies showed up. I appreciate you. And I had a lot of fun recording that episode. And I actually just restarted V's route again for the millionth time, just because I just can't get enough of him. So thanks so much. And I hope if you're out there and you restarted Mystic Messenger again too, I hope you're having a good time. And I would love to see all of your favorite screen grabs as always. I'm so excited for this week's episode because I am actually joined by a new friend named August, who I connected with from a local group that we're both in. And so I am really excited I think this is my third guest. So thanks for coming on the podcast, August.
I am super excited to be here. Thank you so much for putting out this call for people to come and just blab about their favorite franchises. If I can find an excuse to do that, it's always a good time for me. Maybe not for other people, but for me it is.
No, honestly, that is literally the point of the podcast. I love that. And that is the whole reason I started it, because I also feel that way. I love to gush about things that I love, and I want to create a space for other people to do that. So I am going to have a good time, certainly. So thank you for being here. So, like August was saying, whenever I was kind of putting out feelers for this podcast to folks locally, I was trying to expand the properties that I talk about on this show to ones that go beyond the ones that I just engage with personally. Like, obviously, I love to talk about all of my fandoms endlessly. I am very, very excited and willing to talk about the things that I like, but it's also important to me that Get Your Fix is a platform for my community and for voices that don't get heard that often in fandom spaces or media analysis. I can't help it. That's just the type of person that I am, with my background, as you all know, in sociology and organizing and things like that. So I'm going to bring that lens to everything that I do. And when I put out the call, August reached out about doing a Star Trek episode, and I was so excited because it's such an iconic franchise. There's so much reach and influence. There's a lot of modern sci-fi, I think, that has been heavily inspired by Star Trek. It's one of those properties that I feel like everyone has at least one point of reference to. So to me, it's always really special to hear someone who's really connected with a property like that to talk about it, because with these big franchises, anyone can kind of talk about it, but people who are really fans of it really bring a new perspective. So I would love, August, if you could just give us a high level overview of Star Trek, and then also kind of softball us to talking about Worf, since that's the character that we're going to be exploring together.
Okay, awesome. So that is a huge question. Tell me, what is Star Trek? So Star Trek has an over 50-year history of being a franchise. And as you know, if you're familiar, it started in the 1960s as campy kind of daytime show that would run. There would be reruns of it, and it got, a fandom around it, right? Even in the 60s, the key thing about Star Trek is that it promotes diversity, and there are moral messages in a lot of the stories, and it's about a hopeful, progressive view for the future, not necessarily a utopian future, but more so a protopian future, which is, how do we make things better? Even if there are problems that arise within the different Trek series, for example in Deep Space Nine, and then some of the ethical questions that are kind of asked in that series, how can we be better as a society? And it's about infinite diversity and infinite combinations is an integral message to the show. So you have your new Star Trek as in Discovery, having a lot of explicit queer representation on screen. And that's a discussion for another day, what you think of Discovery, because Discovery can be very polarizing for people who may be more disingenuous about why they dislike it. But
Mm-hmm.
there are people who do have valid criticisms of the show. And I kind of fall into that second camp there. Like I'm glad that there's a lot of diversity within Discovery. But I also have issues with some of like the technical things in the show, like the lighting or the pacing of the show. But my rant about Discovery is, again, something for another day. So Star Trek, in essence, is about a hopeful protopian view of the future and learning to coexist and respect all sentient life in the galaxy and forge those relationships, being, stronger together as a society.
That is amazing. I actually did not know that at all because, like, I haven't spent a lot of time with the franchise. So I had no idea that it was that kind of, I guess, like moralistic in a way. Like, I have only seen the like funny clips of like, oh my gosh, who's the main Captain Kirk with like old school Captain Kirk? Like, I haven't really even spent that much time with it. So I didn't realize that it was like had such a strong message. So it sounds like it was kind
Mm-hmm.
of maybe a little bit ahead of its time, or also maybe something to do with like being connected. You said it started in the 60s, right?
Right. And so it was actually progressive for the time, So the crew, right? The bridge, you had your Captain Kirk, but you had people like Uhura, who was like
Mm-hmm.
the first Black woman on the show. And she is the communications officer. And, a lot of Trekkies of color, like especially Black Trekkies, do love O'Hara because
Mm-hmm.
it means like, wow, I can see myself in the future, we belong in the future, and there's
Right.
Sulu, played by openly gay actor George Takei, who is
Oh,
Asian American.
right.
He is Asian American. He's Japanese American, and in the case of George Takei, his family was interned by
Mm-hmm.
the American government in the 40s. He was
Yep.
5. He was 5 years old when he was placed in an internment camp, and so this show happened about like 20-ish years after those events, and people were still kind of grappling with those effects. It was still kind of fresh in their minds, and like a similar way, 9/11 is still in the American psyche. But yeah, to have an Asian American man on this TV show with a Black woman and a woman first officer, number one, was big at that time. Some of the most well-known episodes, like Balance of Terror, like that one is about Spock facing racism because he is a Vulcan, or misplaced racism more so. Balance of Terror is actually one of my favorite episodes of the original series. I really like that one. And Spock himself is technically a biracial character, as he is half Vulcan, half human. So throughout the series, Spock deals with his Vulcan and human identities. And those identities are explored in like not just the original series, but like in Strange New World. Like that's a very new, a modern Star Trek show, and it takes place maybe like between like 10-ish years before the events with Captain Kirk at the helm. So
Mm.
we see Captain Pike and his crew and Spock exploring like what it means to be a human, what it means to be a Vulcan, how he, reconciles those identities too.
I feel like it coincides with a lot of the social justice movements that were happening in the 1960s anyway. Like you mentioned about Japanese internment camps, which like affects communities that we are in or adjacent to as like Asian Americans. And I think it really brings into perspective like how recent those things are in our history. And what was happening in the 60s was like the Vietnam War, right? Like there's a lot of Asian American history that's like steeped in the 60s. So we
Yeah.
could probably talk about that like the whole episode, but I would love if you could tell us a little bit about Worf to like get us into what the conversation that we're going to have today, because I'm really excited about this topic that you pitched, which was talking about Worf as an allegory for transracial adoptee narratives, which I don't think, at least I have never even seen a media analysis exploring any of those dimensions of Worf. So I would love, like, yeah, who is Worf and what kind of connects you to him, I guess.
First, I think it'd be helpful to go over some quick definitions, like what is a transracial adoptee? So the word transracial here sometimes trips people up, but transracial in this context refers to the type of adoption. So it describes somebody who is adopted into a family of a different race than their own. And so in the story, Worf, who we get to meet in Star Trek The Next Generation, the one with Jean-Luc Picard as captain, is a Klingon. So we meet Worf, and he is a Klingon. And Klingons are, one of the most well-known Star Trek species. We see them in the original series, and the appearance of the original series Klingons are a little, how do we say, problematic, because at the time, the Klingons were a stand-in for the Soviet Union and Maoist China because of the Cold
Mm.
War. They were an allegory for the Cold War. And so, appearance-wise, the Klingons were very Asiatic looking. And yes, they were played by white people.
Hmm.
And the Klingons are also a very like a warriors race. They're kind of like the orcs. And being a warrior and being honorable is like integral to like Klingon culture still, even today. That's kind of iconic, when you think of a Klingon, they're honorable, they're warriors. Over the years, like we do get to see fleshed out Klingon characters, especially like in shows like Deep Space Nine. You might hear me mention Deep Space Nine a few times. I love Deep Space Nine. It's unique compared to like some of the other Star Treks series put out there. But it again, it does really well with certain ethical issues and character development.
Is
But
it a
yeah,
TV
so
show?
yes, it's a
Okay,
Star
cool.
Trek series, yeah, called Deep
Awesome.
Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And it's a really great show. But again, with the Klingons, so they are kind of like, and I know orcs in, fantasy have, their kind of tie to like Orientalism, right? In a way that is like what the Klingons were originally used as. Like in the first episode that we see the Klingons, I think he was like a producer or one of the guys, his name was Gene Kuhn. And he wrote in the script that the Klingons were like supposed to be hard faced or like cold faced and Oriental. And that's kind of how they look.
Yeah, I feel like it was much more. I mean, even my family members who are literally Asian will still use the term Oriental, who are like of that older generation who were in their young adulthood in the 60s and 70s. Like it's really wild how commonplace language like that was. And there's tons of podcasts out there that talk about the appropriation of
Yeah.
Asian
It's
identity
God.
in media. Like that happens all the time,
Uh-huh.
right? Like we know that we were not represented well and like still really aren't until I mean it's getting a lot better now, but I feel like it's just now starting to get better like like in the last like 5 years almost.
Hmm. So back to Worf. So Worf is a Klingon, but he is different from the other Klingons. So in Star Trek, there's a trope of having a character be like the outsider's perspective of like human culture. In TOS, it was Spock. In TNG, The Next Generation, you could argue it could be Data the android. And in a way, Worf also could be applied to this trope as well, but with a twist. So not only is he an outsider to humanness because he's not a human, he is an alien, he is also an outsider to his own culture because Worf was raised by humans. He was raised in a human colony by a human couple called the Roshankos. And when he was young, his Klingon parents were killed at an outpost due to a Romulan attack. And so this human couple took him in and raised him as their own. And so through the series, we see Worf navigate what it means to be a Klingon and what it means to be a human in a sense too, and how that cultural experience affects his character. So essentially, Worf is a type of transracial adoptee, like I mentioned at the beginning. He is
Hmm.
more so trans species, but he is very clear, and I wouldn't even call it allegory, but he is a very clear, I guess, representation of somebody who has that experience. And I will say there is no one right experience to be a transracial adoptee or one right adoption experience. And that's the thing I think people get wrong about like what it means to be an adoptee and like adoption itself. And I can talk more about that later. But, I am also a transracial adoptee of sort. I am Asian American, and the family who raised me, my adoptive parents, are white. And like Worf, I did not grow up around many other Klingons, so I know what it's like to be the only Klingon in Starfleet, because at that point when we see Worf, he is the only Klingon in Starfleet. And
Hmm.
Klingons don't usually join Starfleet because Klingons technically are not a part of the Federation. They are allies of the Federation. Well,
Oh,
they
interesting.
come to be, yeah, they come to be allies through TNG stuff,
That's that's a pretty heavy-handed political metaphor, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, Star Trek is known for their heavy-handed metaphors. They literally
Yeah, I
have
love
in
that.
TOS, yeah, in TOS they have like an episode called let this be your last battlefield, and it's about people like they go on a planet and it's people who have a white side of the face and a black side of the face, and
Oh,
like some of them have like the white side of their face on their right side, some of them have the white side of the face on their left side, and yes, it's an allegory for racism. But
right.
yeah, so it's very obvious, like TOS especially was kind of known for that. To varying degrees of success, but that is kind of like, oh, when we think of Star Trek, we think of the progressive political messaging in it. And again, it was a progressive for the time, right? In the time that it was made, in the
Hmm.
60s. But with Worf, he is a character that is, important to me because I am a Trekkie, as somebody who loves Star Trek. It's nice to see an experience that's not really represented on screen. And yes, it is through like an alien kind of metaphor, I guess you could call it. And like the Klingons, even though they do have, questionable history in creation, are one of my favorite species in the series, because over time the Klingons got more fleshed out as a species, and they got more, and they were not like, oh, just an allegory anymore. You get characters like Worf, Martok, Garon, and so they get more fleshed out,
Yeah, I feel like I was kind of mentioning earlier, it's hard to find a lot of overt representation for a lot of these intersectional identities that we often have, like as marginalized people. And when we do find those direct representation, they're often like really tropey and bad. So that's part of what I love about talking about fandom is that you can find these like stories that represent you, even if they're not directly saying out loud like, oh, like Worf is a transracial adoptee and this is for you. Like that's not always where you're going to find the message, but it can be just as impactful. Like I personally, like as like a trans guy, like I see trans masculinity in media all the time, even if it's not like overtly about that. And so that's, I think, what's exciting about feeling connected to like franchises, especially ones as big as Star Trek that cover so many things. Like it's helpful to kind of see yourself in those narratives. And I actually didn't know that history around the Klingons. Like I didn't know there was that history of like Orientalism around their character development. But that's really interesting and a tie-in that is really specific to the topic that we're talking about with Worf.
There's something for everybody in Star Trek. For example, a popular character like Data, I mentioned, he is a popular
Hmm.
character for many neurodivergent people, autistic people in particular. And I love Data. He's a wholesome character, and he's great. And like, I see parts of myself represented in him too. I was talking with some Trekkies, and one of them was like, oh, well, I see myself in like Seven of Nine. And like I see myself in her, as an autistic man. I just see myself in this character, and like I
Hmm.
think a lot of people, in the Star Trek fandom do have a character that they could connect to, whether it's Jadzia Dax or Data, like I have said, or like Spock even. And it's just those little things, Obviously, not everything is perfect about Star Trek, right? And there are like valid criticism of like the way like certain things are represented. And like in the case of Worf, him being a like him kind of having this transracial adoptee kind of journey, as many transracial adoptees do, especially as they get older, because they are not exposed to elements of their culture, right? So there is an
Hmm.
episode in TNG called Family. And in this episode, we get to meet Worf's parents, his human parents. And there is a scene where Worf's mother goes to like the bar on the ship and she talks to the bartender, Guinan. And Guinan asks about her son, and like, gonna be some spoilers here, but I mean, it's an old show, so just
Yeah, I don't think we have to worry about spoilers. It's all good.
yeah. So basically, Worf is already an outcast because he had this human upbringing. He is very human compared to other Klingons, and this is due to his upbringing, of course. But the fact that he's in Starfleet is an unusual thing for Klingons. Helena Roshenko is his adoptive mother, and she's talking to Guinan, and this is after Worf has been considered dishonored by the other Klingons due to so his family, like his Klingon blood, I guess, he was from like a noble family called the House of Moog. And because of this attack, the attack happened because somebody collaborated with the Romulans. And that blame was placed on Worf's family because his parents were dead. So it was just easy to be like, oh, it's the dead guy's fault. And
Right.
everybody just went with that. But in reality, it wasn't. It was someone else. So Worf, he gets outcasted again as somebody who is dishonored, which is considered, a big deal on the Klingon homeworld to be dishonored. And so
Hmm.
essentially he is shunned by the other Klingons. And his family is like his house is now looked, it's not honorable anymore. It's not considered an honorable house anymore. So he has that, I guess, double rejection from, being an outsider, but also being rejected again because of something that he has no control over. Recently, I went to an adoptee conference. I saw somebody on a panel who was queer and a transracial adoptee, and this person was talking about finding their relatives, like doing a birth search.
Hmm.
And they were saying that they were hesitant because they didn't know if they would be rejected for being queer. And
Hmm.
it's like that extra layer of rejection, like, oh,
Yeah.
I am already an outsider in this space, but to alienate myself even more, or to be alienated for something that I had no control over. If we're using war, family ended up being, innocent, and they were not collaborators with the Romulans, but he gets blamed for that, or like that shame falls on him. People think finding reunion or like adoption in a very surface level, like, oh, you should be happy. But adoption and the experience is very complex and nuanced. And for a character who was probably not written by any transracial adoptees at the time, that's just my guess.
It's a pretty safe bet, I bet.
Yeah, it's a pretty safe bet. But it's not, his portrayal isn't horrible. And like,
Hmm.
obviously it's an in like his own individual experience and not a universal thing. But things like feeling out of place even among people who look like you, like that is a very common experience of being a transracial adoptee. I was telling you earlier, like I love to go down to Chinatown sometimes and just walk
Yeah.
around. And for the record, I am Chinese. I did not grow up with a lot of Klingons, so to speak, around
Hmm.
me. My parents were not Klingon. My school was not Klingon. There were a few other people, who did look like me, but they were few and far between. I never like had that experience to just be around people. Wow, these people look like me and they exist. It sounds silly, but it's like just little things like going into Chinatown and blending in with everyone else. And oh, I was saying about Worf's mom, Helena. She was talking to Guinan, and Guinan was asking her what was it like for like when Worf was like growing up, and she was like, and this scene actually in my opinion, from my perspective, was actually really decently done because she says it was hard for him growing up. We knew that he did not have other Klingons around him. And she was like, I tried my best. I learned how to make Klingon food because that's what he would eat,
Mm.
And like that to me, that shows like she was putting effort into knowing her son, you know,
Yeah, and I think
because
there's a
like
lot of
Kling
conversations now around like I feel like more and more narratives in the US now are coming forward of like transracial adoptees sharing like the trauma of being raised by someone that doesn't share your culture and what it's like when people like do try to divorce you from your culture. And so I think, yeah, that sounds really progressive for the show to have her be that kind of transracial adoptive parent because we know now that not everybody is like that when they adopt kids outside of their own race.
hmm Exactly. And like she was like, we knew that Worf would find his own identity. And she let him explore that like his Klingon identity and what it really means to be a Klingon. And so Worf, when we meet him in TNG, he's very stoic and very like his Klingonness, I don't think is necessarily like manufactured, but it is his idea of what it means to be a Klingon compared to the
Mm-hmm.
to like Klingons that we meet, and and his in a way idealized version of his own people that he doesn't really have a lot of experience interacting with, or being around.
Yeah.
And for many transracial adoptees, it is that like, oh, you try so hard to be what they think it means to be an Asian person or a Black person or whatever racial identity they have, right? Or whatever culture they're from or ethnic group. Like I was talking to a mutual who is also a Chinese adoptee, and she was like, well, I tried hard to be like Asian or what people expected me to be Asian. And like I tried to have an Asian friend group and learn an Asian language and have an Asian boyfriend and that kind of stuff because I didn't feel Asian enough. So in a way, Worf sometimes leans very hard into his ideas of being a Klingon and
Mm-hmm.
to the detriment of like, his relationships and the people around him. An example of this is like when we see Worf reintroduced in the series Star Trek Deep Space Nine, we see this in his relationship with Jadzia. And Jadzia is a popular character from Deep Space Nine. She's awesome. She's a Trill, which me and she has spots, and yes, they do go all the way down. But yeah, and it's that is a running joke. Oh, do the spots go all the way down? Like, but
Right.
yeah. So he has this relationship with Tia, but like some of the things he does, are very like rigid. But like he wants to be a Klingon.
What feels really interesting to me about this too is that I think we talk about this a lot in Asian American spaces where we feel like perpetual foreigners all the time anyway. Like for me, for example, like I was born in the US. I'm biracial, like I'm only partially Asian, and like I sometimes have felt in community with other Filipino people like, wow, like I am trying to be Filipino in a way that makes sense to you and to me. And then like there's all these great stories about people going to like their countries of origin and not being accepted. I talked about this a little bit in my K-pop episode, but like some K-pop idols that are Korean but born in the States are treated as foreigners in the country where their parents are from. And then you have that like added layer of being adopted and then you don't have like that direct familial access to your culture, which like kind of increases that feeling of perpetual foreignness kind of wherever you go, I would imagine.
And it's just like to see Worf as, a character, and the more we get to like know about him and learn about him as a person, we get to see like him kind of, deal with the fallout of being dishonored and the experiences of people who are displaced from their own culture, whether it be by their own circumstances or by external circumstances such as war or conflict in Worf's case. And that is true for, some older adoptees, like, well, not just older adoptees in like places of conflict. there are people who are willing to exploit vulnerable people, like into giving
Hmm.
up their children, or like for example, in like the Korean and Vietnamese War, there were like people who like had GI babies like from like American soldiers, and those
Hmm.
children were often like mixed race, and so there was a stigma there, and
Yeah, there's a lot
that
of people
kind
like
of
that in my community too. Like in the Filipino community, there's a lot of those GI
mm-hmm.
babies as well with like American colonization in the Philippines.
Yeah, but like also just like because of the after effects of like the Korean War,
Hmm.
and Korea was actually a known, like South Korea, one of their most popular exports at one time, if not their most popular export, was people.
Mm.
It
Like
was
through the adoption
people.
process.
Yes, like
Mm.
babies, people, not rice or kimchi but people. It was people.
Yeah, I think
Um,
Vietnam and China as well have like a long history of adopting out children to people, especially in the US.
And that can go within like the culture of how in our culture how we see like adoption, and specifically transracial adoption.
Hmm.
There's often like saviorism within this, and I don't really
Right.
see a whole lot of saviorism within Worf's circumstance. Again, this is more of a progressive future, but there's a little hint of there, like, oh well, Worf was like, these people like the way he describes it in one of the first episodes of season one of TNG. He's like, oh well, my parent, like they did this like as an act of kindness, or like something like along those lines, and that's placing like more credit to his adoptive parents, and I'm not saying his adopted parents were bad people or even had like a savior complex, because, like I was saying, Worf's mother seemed very in tune, or tried to be in tune with her son's needs growing up, by like making blood pie for him. It's a Klingon food. Because transracial adoption, like I said, is a very, complex and nuanced experience.
Yeah, so I mean, what are some of the specific, because we've talked a lot about what they do, what they have captured really well, but I know you also wanted to share what you kind of feel like some of the shortcomings are on this narrative. So what are some of the things, like you said, you're also someone as like a Trekkie that has like valid criticism. And so I would love to kind of hear that side of it too, like where you kind of feel like they could have captured this a little bit better.
Well, I think one, they should have, adoptees be involved in the script making process, and that is true for a lot of adoption media pieces. Adoptees are not in the writer's room. They're not, on set. They're not, on stage. And like, while I don't think Worf's, depiction is like awful or bad, like because I do see parts of myself within that, I think the narrative does dip into more of the not necessarily happy adoptee narrative, but more so just like, oh well, Worf is at the debt of his parents. Now they don't do that too much, but through like interactions and stuff, he just seems like he's like, I guess what I would say, like grateful for his parents. And some adoptees do feel that way. I'm not taking away, but a lot of adoptees have more complex feelings around this narrative of having to be grateful for being an adoptee, especially like a lot of transracial adoptees, because being taken out of your community, of origin. And yes, that it's a very specific experience, but it's also, why should I be grateful for something that I have lost, and it's not necessarily an either or thing either. A lot of adoptees feel this, and that's an important narrative to keep in mind when you're talking about adoptees, the adoptee experience. It's this, and
Mhm.
like the existence of multiple truths,
Yeah, and I think like that's something that I feel like all marginalized people can kind of connect on in that very fundamental way of like holding nuance, right? Like I talk about that a lot on the show about like I think it's really important when you're doing media analysis and talking about fandom, like you have to be able to hold nuance. And I feel like our especially online fandom spaces are so bad at that, right? Like it's like if you have this opinion, then you're fundamentally evil and like we're gonna bully you off the internet. But like holding nuance is so essential, especially when you're talking about marginalized identity, because none of us are like single issue people. Like we don't live single issue lives, you know?
Exactly. That's really important, to think about. There's a trope within the Trek community regarding Worf and his son. So Worf ends up having a son, and his
Mm,
son is mostly Klingon and like a quarter human. He's like Klingon because the partner he had, yeah, his son with was half Klingon, half human, and
mm,
so he has a son named Alexander. So the writers don't really do a great job with depicting Worf and Alexander's relationship. And so that kind of turned into, I guess, a meme. And so there is kind of a meme about like how Worf is a bad father. And I think
mm,
it's more than that he is a bad father. And this, also have to like Michael Dorn is a black actor. And I don't see Worf necessarily as a bad father in the sense of, oh, he's a deadbeat dad. He is a
mhm,
father who in from my like at least from an adoptee's perspective, he's struggling how to raise his son as a Klingon because he is still learning to be a Klingon. And so I think Worf is projecting his like he wants his son to be a warrior, right? And because he never got that chance to be a warrior. So he is putting that on his son. And he's not necessarily a bad father for doing it. Obviously, that's not really what his son wanted. He and like his Alexander and Worf should be able to have that discussion because when you consider how Worf was separated from the culture that he was born into, he doesn't really know how to raise a Klingon son. And so he fumbles the bag, right? Like and that
yeah.
makes sense. Like how do I raise a son who will experience life as a Klingon, but I don't know how to prepare him for that. Like part of the issue with like Worf, the relation, like the Worf and Alexander storyline is that the writers kind of neglected it, so we just kind of forgot about Alexander, and so
Mm.
like, which is where that kind of, so that's kind of like a writer's room fault too. I think I wish there was maybe a little bit more nuance in that depiction. Like maybe he's not depicting like he's not just neglecting his son to neglect him. Maybe he's struggling with his identity himself and and he's putting that on his son. And so because he is a single father because his like the baby mom dies, like she gets killed, and so he like is a single father too, and that's he's a single father, he's a high ranking Starfleet officer, so he just kind of like they have him like just send his son down to Earth to live with, Worf's parents. So, yeah, I think they could have done a lot better with the depiction of his son and like maybe like dug a little deeper with, oh, like how does he navigate this with, and it's touched on like a little bit with through a conversation with Guinan, I believe. But it's still like a lot of people just read it as, oh, Worf is just a bad father. Like, um, but I think it's so much more than that.
Yeah, and I think again, like talking about holding nuance, like probably is true that he's a bad father, but there are reasons for that, right? Like it's not just that he's like a bad person. And I think like having narratives that talk about intergenerational trauma are really important, especially for those of us, who are cross-cultural, like multi-ethnic. There's a great book that's called It Didn't Start With You, and how we like all of our parents re-traumatize us with their own baggage, right? Like that's just part of the gig, unfortunately.
Yeah. But there is a scene in Deep Space Nine where Worf, up until a point in Deep Space Nine, Worf is kind of on his own in a Klingon sense, right? Like
Hmm.
he doesn't really have a lot of family. Like he doesn't have a lot of Klingon family. He has a Klingon brother, but his Klingon brother ends up going under like a genetic transformation. And so,
Mm.
and like a memory wipe. and they also memory wipe his brother. And so his brother doesn't have to live with the baggage of like his family being dishonored. In this episode,
Hmm.
it's him and his brother. And then at the end, his brother ends up like doing this memory wipe and like transformation. His brother, wakes up from the memory wipe and he's like, "Oh, are you my brother?" And Worf responds, "I do not have any family."
Mm,
He doesn't have a Klingon family. You can feel his like isolation in that scene. Then at the end, like he just like walks off by himself.
right.
Um, and the camera like cuts out. A lot of adoption agencies are, for profit and they want to make money. And some of them are not always ethical, or some of them are corrupt, even. And so, because of the supply and demand, and obviously it's easier to exploit vulnerable people in vulnerable countries. Again, adoption is a nuanced experience, but it is true that there are very exploitative companies who do exploit, new moms or moms in poverty or families in
Hmm.
poverty to give up their children, or they get tricked. They children that children actually get kidnapped. Um,
Yeah.
and that's not an uncommon experience for like many for trans not many but for transracial adoptees to learn about their adoption, is that they were like essentially like kidnapped or just taken. But there's also an episode where Worf does get to find Martok, and Martok is a Klingon. He is like, a Klingon, like I think he's like a war veteran or whatever. He's like also like a captain, and he is from like, I guess what you would call like a working class family. And
Hmm.
but he like he worked his way up, up in the ranks. So in that way he differs from Worf. He was not born into like nobility or honor, but he accepts Worf into his house. So Klingons like have houses. And so this would be the House of Martok. And
Right.
he, and in this scene, it's in Deep Space Nine, he asks Worf to be in his house because he knows that Worf is essentially houseless.
Right.
And so he accepts him like as he is, and like being a transracial adoptee and in this experience, Worf is, isolated from his community a lot of the time. This is true for many transracial adoptees. And, there's that old saying, two east for the west, two west for the east. And like
Yep.
being like too quote unquote human for the Klingons and like for your own community. Yet now there's this person who is accepting you into their clan, into their house, into his community, so he can be around, like he can be with other Klingons, and he
Yeah, and like
can,
have access to his culture of origin. That's awesome.
yeah. And we love Martok. He's great. Uh, yeah, I actually got to meet the actor J.G. Hertzler at a convention earlier this year.
Oh my God, that's
Which
amazing.
So they had this Star Trek convention in the city, and it was a very small convention, but it had a lot of fan favorites. People come, and not
Hmm.
necessarily people like Picard or Kirk, but like there were like a lot of people from like Deep Space Nine, like Bashir. I'm just using the character names, but Bashir, Kira, Jadzia. So like those are like popular characters, and Murtaugh was there, and but like his character just accepts Worf, as a Klingon. He doesn't really question. Like he knows that Worf was not raised by Klingons, and he knows Worf is different. Because he acts different than the other Klingons. He tries to act Klingon, but like he does it with like a human accent, I would say.
Right.
Um,
I really like
and,
that characterization of it. Like I think that's a really good way to capture these experiences like of like trying to do your culture but with like the accent of a different one. I love
mhm,
that. I think
yeah.
that's a really good way to characterize it. But But we're actually coming to the end of our episode. We're just almost out of time. But thank you so
Okay.
much. Like, I feel like I've learned so much about the franchise, even just like about this one character. And I have learned a lot about like transracial adoptees as well. Like I have had a lot of experiences with folks in that community and like done research and stuff, but it was nice to like hear directly from you who has that lived experience. And so as we're like coming to the end of our episode, is there anything that you want to like share or plug or anything, or where people can find you after if you want? Any projects that you're working on that you want to talk about?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your
Yeah.
podcast. I really enjoyed talking to you and talking about this character and how like the character is a character that I deeply resonate with, as somebody who has that experience. And like, yeah, I know what it's like to like be that type of Klingon. Like there's something for everyone in Star Trek, I like to say. Like I like to think. And this is like mine. Like this
Mhm.
is like what I get out of it. I don't have a whole lot to plug, but I am part of a group for, transracial adoptees. And it's a new group that came out of the group that we were, acquainted in.
Mhm.
But it's called Q-Trap, so Queer Transracial Adoptees of Philadelphia and surrounding areas. You can check out our Instagram. It's at qtrap.philly or QTRA.Philly. And you can check out that Instagram account for announcements and events hosting because we're going to probably be planning an event coming up because we had a popular turnout for our pilot kind of or pre-pilot
Mhm.
run event. It's me, run by me, and two other great, amazing people. And we're excited to get this off the ground. So if you are a queer identifying transracial adoptee in the Philly area or surrounding areas, feel free to reach out on that Instagram.
And I will I'll include all those links in the description as always too, so that you all can find it really easily. But that is amazing. Well, thank you so much, August. I really enjoyed having you today. All right. So that is all for this episode, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Come hang out with me on Instagram. As always, I'm at Get Your Fix Pod on Instagram. That is where I hang out the most. And let me know if you enjoyed this exploration of such a well-known franchise through this like kind of more specific lens. I know that I did. I feel like I got a lot out of it, and I hope that you do too. And if you liked this episode and you want to support the show, you can leave me a review on whatever platform you're listening to this on right now. Turn on automatic downloads. Those two things really help a lot in helping Get Your Fix get discovered. And as always, if you want me to chat about a specific property that you're excited about, or you have thoughts on one that I've already covered, you can send me an email at getyourfixpod@gmail.com. I love to read your messages and talk about the things that you want to talk about. So I will catch you all in the next one to chat about our next hyperfixation.